Good afternoon and welcome to the second of three scheduled informational webinars for the 2020-2021 Multimodal Local Supplement, or MLS. My name is Merrill Meckler-Hickson. I am the DOT Program Officer for WisDOT Local Programs. With me today is Ryan Spate, the statewide Program Manager for MLS. And today we will be giving an overview of the MLS program. The presentation portion of the webinar should take less than an hour, so we will have a good amount of time to answer and address common questions at the end of the presentation. If you have already created a Vimeo account, you will be able to submit questions through the live chat box. On the upper right of the screen, you should see a small bubble icon. If you click on that icon, it will open up a live chat box. Throughout today's webinar, if we cover a topic and you have immediate questions, we encourage you to submit questions through the text box. We have people present off camera who will be answering as many text box questions as possible in real time. You do need to have a Vimeo account in order to submit questions through the text box. If you do not have a Vimeo account, you can also send questions to the same email address that you sent your webinar registration to, dotlocalprograms@dot.wi.gov, which is shown here in the middle of the screen. At the end of the presentation, we will be selecting some recurring questions and topics that sound like they probably would apply to multiple people who are viewing the webinar today. However, if we don't get to your specific question during the Q&A session, don't worry, we will be posting the full webinar question and answer list after the final webinar. And if you do have questions after the webinar has completed, you can always send them to the DOT inbox, or you can call either Ryan or me directly. I know that we've already spoken to a lot of you up to this point. So here is the agenda for the webinar presentation today. We'll be starting with some general information about the MLS program, including WisDOT staff contacts. Then we'll be moving on to discuss MLS sponsor and project eligibility, the MLS application, highlighting key parts of the application form itself and the application process, the project selection process, including some important milestone dates, as well as some items to be aware of related to project delivery, along with some important informational reference links. We will close with a Q&A session. So what is MLS? The Wisconsin Department of Transportation is going to be providing funding through a one-time state-funded grant program designed to address critical transportation needs throughout Wisconsin. This $75 million Multimodal Local Supplement grant program is available to local and tribal government applicants. Project eligibility for the MLS program is very broad, and it is open to an expanded range of transportation modes or types of projects than is generally typical for WisDOT local programs. Multimodal improvements that include more than one modal type are also eligible for funding. MLS also offers up to a 90% state cost share, which is higher than typical state cost share levels. While the MLS program is not governed by parameters that apply to other local programs, please note that there are no exemptions from laws that generally apply to specific types of expenditures. So the laws that ordinarily apply to certain projects or expenditures will continue to apply. As I mentioned previously, my name is Merrill Meckler-Hickson. You will be hearing from Ryan Spate in a few minutes when we cover the MLS application process. This is our contact info, which is also available on the WisDOT website, as well as within the MLS application materials. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us about applying for an MLS grant, or if you have any questions at all regarding the MLS program. The $75 million set aside for the MLS program is one-time additional funding in state dollars out of the general fund targeted for new projects that do not necessarily qualify for funding in our other local programs. An example would be construction of new bridges, which is a type of project that would not qualify in our local bridge program. MLS funding is available for an expanded range of project types, meaning roads and bridges, but also harbors, transit, bicycle pedestrian, and railroad projects. MLS has expanded local sponsor eligibility, which means that while the primary sponsor has to be a local government with taxable authority, private entities are eligible as secondary project sponsors. Also, any of Wisconsin's 11 federally recognized tribal governments are eligible to apply for MLS funding. MLS funding is available for new projects only. It cannot be added to existing state, federal, or locally funded projects that already have committed funding. This includes all projects that have previously been advertised for bid. The MLS program funds projects up to a 90% state cost share for eligible project costs. Projects may be recommended for funding at less than 90% based on final committee deliberations, the merits of the individual projects, as well as the total number of applications received. The focus of the program is on local project delivery and administration. However, some complex projects with a federal interest may require departmental oversight. And departmental oversight is also available upon local sponsor request, regardless of project complexity. The MLS funding thresholds are minimum total project costs of $250,000 for counties, cities, and villages, and $50,000 for towns, with a maximum MLS project award amount of $3.5 million. MLS is a reimbursement program. This allows for partial reimbursement as costs are incurred, so projects can be basically reimbursed as you go with the appropriate documentation at key milestone dates throughout project delivery. MLS has a multimodal connectivity focus, and here is a general breakdown of the different modes or types of eligible projects. Road and bridge improvement projects are eligible, and so are transit vehicle purchases and facility construction. Bicycle and pedestrian trails, railroad, port and harbor improvements are all eligible for MLS funding. However, it is important to note that certain types of projects are still ineligible. Design-only projects and planning studies are ineligible regardless of modal type. Airport runways and facilities are ineligible. However, a road or a bridge leading into an airport would be eligible. Connecting highway projects are ineligible, as these projects currently receive connecting highway aids. Maintenance activities and operations costs, things like trail vegetation management, for example, would be ineligible. Another example, the initial installation of harbor buoys. That would be something that would be eligible for MLS funding, but the subsequent maintenance of those buoys would be ineligible. Transit vehicle purchases are eligible for MLS funding. However, purchases of salt trucks or snow plows, things that would be used for more maintenance type activities, would be ineligible. Rail car and ferry boat acquisitions are ineligible projects. However, equipment like radios and GPS units are eligible components for railroad and harbor projects. As you complete your MLS application, carefully review the MLS guidance documents that are available on the WISDOT website for what constitutes an eligible project. If you still have questions as to what constitutes an eligible MLS project or project cost, please send an email to the MLS inbox, the same email address that you used to register for this webinar, or you can call Ryan or me directly. The $75 million of available MLS funding is split into three categories, with an allocation for counties, an allocation for cities and villages, and an allocation for towns. The goal of the program is to allocate all available MLS funding. The funding breakdowns are available in the MLS guidelines, which are currently available on the WISDOT website. Please note that there is no set amount per individual county or municipality. MLS awards are completely discretionary, and the appropriate committee will review and score applications within each of these three categories. There are also no set funding amounts for any individual modal type. There are minimum MLS total project costs dependent on municipality type. Again, $250,000 for counties, cities, and villages, and $50,000 for towns, with, again, a maximum MLS project award amount of $3.5 million. The project can be larger, but $3.5 million is the largest MLS award amount. Now, what we mean by total project cost would be the total of all eligible and ineligible costs. In the funding section, Section G, please give a breakdown of project costs between eligible costs and ineligible non-participating costs. This is something that is not expressly stated on the application itself. However, if it is not included, we will be contacting you for clarification if we cannot figure out the math from the provided application materials. Finally, please note that MLS projects will have a 6-year project completion or sunset requirement, and this is something, again, that is pretty standard across all of WisDOT's local programs. MLS applications will be scored in a competitive project selection process. The MLS Selection Committee structure follows the 3 MLS funding categories, with separate committees for counties, cities and villages, and towns. Each of these committees will be comprised of local stakeholders and elected officials. Geographic distribution across Wisconsin will be a consideration both in the formation of the selection committees themselves and for final MLS project selections. WisDOT staff will be facilitating these committee meetings. However, we will not be scoring any of the applications. If a tribal government application is received for the MLS program, a tribal government representative will be appointed by the WisDOT Secretary's office to sit on the committee that would be reviewing that application. Each committee will evaluate applications based on 2 scores. One score, with a maximum of 25 points, will be based on criteria specific to the application's modal type. And again, by modal type, we mean whether the application is for a road project or for a bridge project, etc. There is a multimodal category for applications that have more than one modal type, but the maximum score for that category, again, is still just 25 points. No preferential scoring will be given to any particular modal type. A table showing a more detailed breakdown of the modal scoring is available in the MLS guidelines available on the WisDOT website. The other score, also with a maximum of 25 points that will universally apply to all MLS applications, will evaluate the application's economic impact, connectivity, cost effectiveness, as well as other considerations such as the regional significance of the project. This means that an MLS application can get a maximum total of 50 points. Final project selections are going to be forwarded by the statewide MLS committees to the WisDOT Secretary for final award. Project awards will be announced in early 2020. Please note that our goal is to announce these MLS awards prior to the announcement of awards for other local programs. It is important to remember MLS funding cannot be used in conjunction with other local programs funding, say through Local Bridge or through the LRIP program. And we do understand that the potential 90% state cost share could make an MLS award the more attractive project funding option. We do encourage local sponsors to continue to apply for other local program funding sources through Local Bridge, STP, our TAP program, etc., concurrently along with their MLS application. We will then announce the MLS awards first, and you can make an informed project funding decision. At this point, we would like to go into a bit more detail about MLS sponsor and project eligibility. This is a topic that we've already gotten a lot of questions about, so we do want to make sure that we have it covered fairly thoroughly. As stated previously, primary MLS project sponsors must be local units of government with the taxing authority to guarantee availability of local match funds. Wisconsin's 11 federally recognized tribal governments are also eligible to be primary MLS project sponsors. Private organizations, say for example Wisconsin's privately owned railroad companies, are eligible to be secondary sponsors for MLS projects. While these secondary sponsors can be funding partners or key partners in the project completion process, the MLS state municipal agreement will always be with the primary sponsor. Regarding eligible MLS project costs, real estate costs over $100,000 are eligible for program funding. Keep in mind that real estate cannot be acquired through eminent domain. The statutory reference for that is Wisconsin Stats Chapter 32.05. We do have that reference link later on in this presentation. Also, keep in mind for projects that could get federal funds in the future, MLS real estate purchases may also have Federal Uniform Act implications. Real estate acquisitions can potentially cause project delays, so that's always a good point to keep in mind. Please also note utility costs related to relocation, removal, or new utilities are ineligible. Storm sewers and culverts are eligible as components of an MLS project, but they should not total as the majority of eligible project costs. Again, on your application, please remember to break out your eligible and your ineligible costs in Section G when you are reporting your total project cost. If you need an environmental permit, please note local sponsors are responsible for contacting the appropriate regulatory agency, be that the Army Corps of Engineers, the DNR, or the Wisconsin Historical Society for Archaeological and Historical Concerns. If you have any questions about any of these topics, please call either Ryan or me. As applications come in and are reviewed, WisDOT will determine project complexity based on factors like complex environmental issues. And if we determine that state oversight is necessary, we will be reaching out directly to the project sponsor. Any additional costs for state oversight would be eligible for MLS funding. Departmental oversight, again, is also available upon local sponsor request, regardless of project complexity, and local project sponsors may reach out to the county for administrative oversight. These administrative costs themselves are also eligible for MLS funding. Now I would like to review what types of improvement projects are eligible for each of the modal types that are eligible for MLS funding. This is probably the area where we've gotten the most questions, so we do want to make sure that we cover it fairly thoroughly. For road and bridge improvement projects, funding is available for newly funded road or bridge improvements for replacement, reconstruction, rehabilitation, or widening. Construction of brand new roads or bridge structures are also eligible for funding. Road or bridge projects that are located on the national highway system or complex projects, again, may require departmental oversight. These oversight costs, again, are themselves eligible for MLS funding. Each MLS modal type is also subject to some eligibility restrictions. As mentioned previously, connecting highways are not eligible for MLS. They have their own funding stream. While MLS does not follow all of the program rules for local bridge removal only projects are ineligible. They're also ineligible for the MLS program. This is a funding program that does focus on connectivity. Equipment purchases, snowplows would be an example, and maintenance activities are also not eligible for MLS road and bridge funding. For transit improvements, MLS funding is available for newly funded projects related to transit vehicle purchase, transit equipment like GPS units, new transit facility construction, and existing transit facility upgrade projects. Operation costs and maintenance activities, once again, are not eligible for funding through the MLS program. For bicycle, pedestrian, and other alternative transportation improvements, MLS funding is available for newly funded projects related to on-road and off-road trail facilities, rails to trails projects on abandoned railway corridors, ATV and snowmobile non-mixed use trails, in other words, trails that are motorized use only, and upgrades to historic transportation facilities, for example, repurposing an old train depot. Examples of bicycle and pedestrian improvements that would be ineligible for MLS funding would include outdoor advertising, trails that would be designated as motorized and non-motorized mixed use, operations costs such as vegetation management, and again, maintenance activities. I should mention that a key point to keep in mind really for any modal type application, including for bicycle and pedestrian projects, the MLS program really is focused on economic benefits and connectivity. So please remember to highlight these types of benefits in your application narrative. MLS funding is also available for certain types of railroad improvements. For these types of projects, counties likely would be primary sponsors, with private railroad companies as secondary sponsors. Eligible railroad improvements include newly funded projects for rail line rehabilitation, railroad bridge improvements, passenger rail enhancements, brand new intermodal freight facility construction, as well as upgrades to existing intermodal freight facilities. Rail car purchases are ineligible for MLS funding, as are, once again, railroad operations costs and maintenance activities. Lastly, MLS funding is also available for certain types of port and harbor improvements. Privately owned ferries, like privately owned railroads, can only be secondary MLS sponsors. A municipality with taxing authority must serve as the primary sponsor. The secondary sponsor then would contract with the primary MLS sponsor on the project. Eligible harbor improvements include newly funded projects for harbor dredging, port infrastructure expansion, or upgrades including buoy installation. Ferry equipment purchase, although not acquisition of a ferry boat itself, and repair of existing dock walls. Freight rail expansion to a harbor facility could be a part of a multimodal MLS application that would be eligible for funding. As with every other MLS eligible modal type, operations costs and maintenance activities are not eligible for MLS funding. So there is a general overview of the key points for the MLS program. Again, I would direct you to the MLS guidance materials posted on the WISDOT website as you fill out your application. At this point, I would like to turn the presentation over to MLS Program Manager Ryan Spate, who will go over the MLS application form and then talk a little bit about the selection process and project delivery.
Thank you, Merrill, and hello, everyone. I'll begin with the application process. So on the screen, application materials have been posted to the WISDOT website, which is linked. That includes 3 documents. First, the guidelines for the MLS program. Second, the application itself. And third, the instructions for the application. We'll also send this PowerPoint out for your reference on October 11th after the last webinar broadcasts. A replay of a webinar broadcast will also be available at that time. The deadline to send MLS applications to the DOT local programs at dot.wi.gov inbox is close of business Friday, December 6th, which is linked on screen. Applications will not be accepted after this December 6th deadline, but you can feel free to submit your applications earlier. You don't have to wait until the 6th of December to submit your application. This slide can act as sort of a checklist for yourself as you're completing your application. In order for an application to be considered complete, you would need to fill in all fields of the appropriate modal sections. The only sections in the application that we would expect to see blank are modal sections not applicable to the project. In the sections that are appropriate for the project, you would complete all of the fields within those sections. If you're submitting an application with 2 or more modal types, you'll need to complete a section for each modal type in the project. And complete applications will have a narrative section that clearly outlines the project's scope and the benefits of the project. The primary sponsor of the project must have authority for it and will be responsible in the state municipal agreement. If you have a secondary sponsor for the project, that signature also needs to be included in the application. For each application, you'll need a map of the project location. You can get a map from Whistler, which is a WISDOT system, or you can get it from your own GIS system. It can even be a Google map as long as it includes all relevant information for the project, including the project termini. Complete applications will also clearly delineate eligible and ineligible costs, as Merrill mentioned earlier. On the application, we've included an additional funding comments box which can serve that purpose. We've also indicated that it is acceptable to attach a one-page Excel spreadsheet that breaks down eligible and ineligible costs. Now we'll walk through the application itself. I'm just going to highlight key points of the application as we're going through it. I should note that we do have an application instructions document posted on the WISDOT website, so please check those instructions first if you have questions about a particular field or section as you're filling out the application. On the screen is the first section of the application, which would need to be completed for all projects. In the improvement type field, there is a checkbox for multiple modal types. So if a project has 2 or more modal types included, you would select multiple and then you would also fill out all the sections that pertain to those modes later in the application. Please fill in the secondary project sponsor field if a project has private ownership or shared costs for construction. If you don't know the construction schedule date, please fill in the construction schedule date box with your best estimate. The shovel-ready checkbox essentially just indicates if you're ready to go with the project. So if this is true, let us know by checking the box yes, because it may be useful information to the committees as they select projects. Projects are not required to be shovel-ready, but projects do need to be completed within the 6-year sunset window. Now we'll transition to the mode-specific sections of the application. Please only complete these sections if your project includes a road or a bridge, otherwise you would leave them blank. The surface type and bridge type fields are both drop-down menus, so please select the appropriate option from these drop-down menus. Much of the data for these road and bridge sections is available on Whistler or HSI, both of which are linked below. And you can also populate fields with local data if you have it, but to be clear, you are not expected to go out and do a new forecast or study. You should simply rely on the data that you have available and use whatever data is the most recent. Everything else needs to be filled in for the appropriate sections of your application. If data in a particular field can't be found, for example, we've had some questions about average daily traffic and truck percentage, you would fill in NA or not applicable so that we know that you've looked at the field but that you don't have the data. Even if you have estimated data for these fields, please provide it in the application. You can explain how you arrived at that estimate in the narrative section, which I'll touch on in a minute. So these are more mode-specific sections of the application. If your project includes transit, railroad, bicycle, pedestrian, or harbors, you would complete the appropriate sections in these parts of the application. In the transit section, you can fill in a short description of the project, but there's also a narrative field later in the application form where you can expand if there's not enough space in these boxes to get at that point. Please note that a map is required for transit projects, even though it is not specified on the application. And in the railroad section, the type of railroad improvement field is a drop-down menu, so again, you would select the appropriate option from that drop-down menu. For harbors, specifically the transportation economic impact and benefit to local economy fields, we would expect these to be completed, and what we're looking for in these fields are dollar amounts, and you can further explain the figures that you arrived at in the additional funding comments box later in the application form. So a location map is required with each application, and on the screen is an example of a Whistler-produced map, which is a WISDOT system. But again, as I mentioned earlier, you don't have to rely on Whistler. You can use your own map or a Google map, but what's important is that we have the precise termini of the project included in the map, and also that if a project includes multiple segments, we would expect to see all of those segments marked on the same map. For something like a transit vehicle purchase, a map is required. So what you would do is you would show the route this vehicle will serve on your map. So now we'll move on to the narrative section. At this point, you're sort of reaching the end of the application. The narrative section is required for all applications, and we're looking at it as your opportunity to include additional information about the scope of your project and the key benefits of the project. You'll describe what you're doing, where the project is, and what the benefits of the project are. The narrative section is basically your opportunity to write up what you're doing so that the guy next door would understand what your project is. In other words, be clear, concise, and avoid technical language whenever possible when filling out the narrative section. The narrative section is limited to one-page double-spaced with 10-point font, but you can feel free to attach photos if you like. These photos will not count against the narrative page limit, and photos can be really helpful for the committees. Again, I'll take this opportunity to reiterate that each application does need to include a map. Make sure that in this narrative section you touch on the project value, service life, and the economic benefit of the project. You're not required to perform a technical cost-benefit analysis, although you could, but the discussion of project value and benefits should be clearly articulated. Committees will need this information as they're scoring applications. The narrative section is also where you would indicate if you anticipate a complex environmental issue with the project. The funding section is also required for all applications. If you've indicated that your application is for both design and construction, you would fill in both the design costs and construction costs fields and then total them below. If the project is construction only, you would put an NA or not applicable in the design cost field. And always you would leave the state review fields blank because WISDOT will use these ourselves and fill them in if a project requires state oversight. The MLS offers up to a 90% state cost share, and on the form we're asking if you would accept less than that. The process is competitive and we want this information to be available to the committees. In the additional funding comments box toward the bottom, you can enter funding-related comments and break down cost calculations for all elements of the project. As Meryl indicated earlier, we do need a project breakdown of eligible and ineligible costs. The additional funding comments box is where you would do this. You would clearly delineate the eligible and ineligible costs, and that is a really important point of the application. One last thing for the funding section of the application is that a spreadsheet for cost calculations can be attached to the application. The signature section of the application, which is the last section, is now on the screen, and it's required for all applications. Head of government or a designee signing this document needs to have the legal authority to do so. If you have a secondary project sponsor, either a funding partner or someone with a responsibility for work, we would expect to see that secondary sponsor signature field completed. Please carefully review your application prior to submitting and ensure that all attachments are in order when making your submission. Once you've done your last glance over of your application, you would send the completed application to the DOT local programs at dot.wi.gov inbox. And you would submit your entire application with all attachments in a single email, not separate emails. And additionally, we can only accept electronic submissions to the DOT local programs inbox. So now we'll transition into the selection process. As applications are received by the department, we'll review them for completeness and for the potential need for state oversight. As stated earlier, the MLS has 3 committees, one for counties, one for towns, and one for cities and villages. The committees are made up of local officials, and for towns there are also a few industry reps that sit on the committee. WISDOT will facilitate these committees, but as Meryl mentioned, we do not participate in the scoring of applications, nor do we participate in the selection of projects. Instead, it will be the committees that review the applications and score them. Then the committees will make the final recommendation to the WISDOT secretary for the approval of awards. Project awards will be announced in early 2020 before the award announcements of other local programs. The purpose of doing that is to allow local sponsors who apply to both the MLS and another local program to know the outcome of their MLS application prior to the announcement of other local program awards. Sponsors cannot accept funding through other local programs. So for example, if you apply to both the local bridge program and the MLS program and you're awarded both, you would have to select between those awards. You cannot accept both. As noted in the MLS guidelines, here is a breakdown of the number of points possible. As Meryl mentioned, there is no priority granted to a particular modal type. Each project is, again, eligible for up to 50 points within the scoring rubric. 25 of those points are for modal type. So, for example, within the bicycle pedestrian modal type, you'll earn points for speaking to the project's impact on safety and accessibility and whether it creates a modal shift. For roads, committees would look at safety, serviceability, and the alleviation of traffic congestion. All of the other modal types have criteria for this section of the scoring rubric as well. It can be found in the MLS guidelines document, which is available on the WISDOT website. The other 25 points are universal scoring factors, and now that we've looked at the application, I want to revisit them and emphasize the importance of thinking about these universal scoring factors while filling out your application. Make sure that your application addresses the economic impact, connectivity, and cost effectiveness of the project. So, for example, for economic impact, you would speak to how the project is going to spur economic growth. For connectivity, does the project connect to any job centers? And for cost effectiveness, how does the improvement compare to alternatives in terms of its cost? The best place to speak to this would be the narrative section, which we've discussed. Now we'll transition to a discussion of MLS project delivery. A reminder that MLS projects don't need to follow other local program rules, but on the screen are some standards and requirements that do need to be followed. Projects will be primarily locally let, and additionally, projects are not subject to the design standards of the FDM, but I will note that it can be a useful tool. Projects must, however, meet the following design standards, which primarily apply to roads and bridges. Those design standards are Transcode 205 for counties, the FDM 1121 for cities and villages, and Transcode 204 for towns. Within those transcodes, if there is an exception to standards needed, we would expect to see that noted in the application narrative section. In addition to these design standards, we have some reference slides at the end of the presentation that provide other state statutes that you are not exempt from when designing your project. While these projects will be primarily locally let and administered, and in most cases will not require state oversight, there are a few reasons that we might require state oversight, and I'll go through those really quickly. So first, if the project is particularly complex. Second, if the project triggers a federal action. Or third, if the project is in an urbanized planning area and has a particular regional significance. Those might be reasons why we would require state oversight. These factors might not mandate a state let, but if any of these are true, WSDOT will review the application and determine if state oversight is needed. If it is required, WSDOT will contact the project sponsor and work out what those costs are likely to be. And this is likely to be based on a percentage of the project costs. Once we speak to the project sponsor, those costs will be added into the estimates provided in the application by the application sponsor. And I'll note that those oversight costs would be eligible for funding through the MLS, and that they'll automatically be added into project costs. Regardless of project complexity, the local sponsor is responsible for delivering the project and for providing all of the relevant documentation for reimbursement. The local municipality also has the option of working with the county for oversight if the county is agreeable to that option. All of these administrative costs would be eligible for funding. As soon as the awards are announced, we'll begin working with sponsors to get the state municipal agreements signed. As a reminder, please don't advertise your project until the SMA is signed. But along with that final signature, you will receive an authorization to incur costs form, and that will be your official notification from WSDOT that you can get started and that those costs will be eligible for reimbursement. Costs incurred prior to the authorization to incur costs are not eligible for reimbursement. And please remember that projects must be advertised, competitively bid, and awarded to the lowest responsible bidder. We've received some questions about having to competitively bid and advertise projects, so we wanted to be clear on the requirements for doing so. Those requirements are on the screen. This is important because we'll require documentation on this in order to begin reimbursement. And we know that in some instances, counties have restrictions for bidding on projects through LRIP, but in the MLS, counties are eligible to bid, counties are eligible to bid. However, counties are not exempt from the rules in state statutes 5952. And if you have any questions on the requirements on bidding and advertising presented on this slide, please contact us. We would expect you to competitively bid your project and that you would do so as a single advertisement. So please do not break the project down into its component parts and advertise components of the project separately. We've also received a few questions about this, so I want to specify that consultants who write the application on behalf of the sponsor are eligible to respond to the design solicitation. Unlike LRIP, which has one reimbursement at the completion of the project, the MLS program allows for reimbursement as you go. provided that documentation is submitted at each point where you're requesting reimbursement. Some of the documentation that is required for reimbursement is on the screen, but there could be other items depending on the project and what you're requesting reimbursement for. But what's true for every item that you're requesting reimbursement for is that we'll need the appropriate documentation in order to process that request. So some points to keep in mind once your project is underway. First, in order to receive complete reimbursement, the project must be complete within the 6-year sunset window. Second, reimbursement cannot exceed the MLS award, so these are capped projects, and along with that, remaining funds cannot be used for another project. The third point to keep in mind is that because these projects are locally led and for the most part locally administered, you need to maintain all project documentation in case of project review or project audit. Here are some references on the next slide that may be helpful as you are completing the application. You'll need a WAMS ID to access data on the local system in Whistler, which is where you can produce a map or find data on average daily traffic and pavement rating, which you need to include in the road-specific modal section of this application. For additional bridge information, on the screen is a link to HSI. HSI is helpful for finding data for the bridge-specific modal section of the application, such as structure and deck rating. Those would be two fields that you might find in HSI. Another helpful reference, depending on your project type, is the WSDOT Facilities Development Manual, or the FDM. As I stated earlier, the FDM is not required except for 1121 for cities and villages, but it does have good guidance on design standards. As mentioned earlier, there are no specific program parameters for the MLS, but nor are there exceptions from laws that generally apply to specific types of expenditures. So the laws that ordinarily apply to certain projects or expenditures will continue to apply and should be followed. These next reference slides provide examples of those laws. Again, as we've seen before, that's Transcode 204 for towns, Transcode 205 for counties, and the FDM 1121 for cities and villages for design standards. Please reference Transcode 301 on the screen if the project involves purchasing a human service vehicle. And we also link to statute on the next slide on eminent domain and condemnation, bidding and advertising, along with county work rule restrictions and bike ped guidance. In closing, please make sure that your application is as complete as possible. It really helps the committees who will score the applications. And now I will turn it back over to Meryl to respond to some of the questions that we've received.
All right, thank you, Ryan. We're going to go over some of the questions that we've gotten over the last couple of days since the first webinar, as well as some questions that have come in today. If we don't get to your specific question during this Q&A session, it is going to be included within the full Q&A that's going to be posted next week. We are shooting to have that up by October 11th. First question, can a local sponsor apply for funding through a different source, for example, DNR, at the same time as they submit an MLS application, and will that hurt an MLS application? Yes, remember MLS funding cannot be combined with other state funding, but as long as it's a new project and it's an eligible project type for both funding sources, it is possible to apply for MLS funding along with other programs. Make sure that project applications meet all of the eligibility rules for each of the programs that the applications are being submitted for. Applying for other programs concurrently is not going to negatively impact your MLS application score, and we do want to be clear about that point. Another question, and this is a question that we've gotten a lot, I think Ryan already kind of addressed it, but if a consultant helps a municipality fill out the MLS application, can they subsequently bid for the design work? And the answer to that is yes. Consultants that complete an application are eligible to respond to the design solicitation. Another question that we've got, to which committee are tribal government applications assigned? The MLS guidelines specify that if an eligible tribal government application is related to a specific county or municipal facility, the application would be forwarded to the selection committee that would normally score that type of application. A tribal government representative then would be appointed by the WSDOT secretary to sit on any committee that has been forwarded a tribal government MLS application. If an eligible application is not related to a specific facility, or if the facility is somewhat ambiguous, WSDOT is going to be examining the applications on a case-by-case basis to determine what the appropriate committee is that should be reviewing the tribal government application. Another question, does the project have to be bid in fiscal year 2020 or fiscal year 2021? The answer to that is no. The projects are not going to be even announced until early 2020. Please remember, though, that all MLS projects are still going to be subject to that 6-year sunset requirement from the date of the project award. Another question that we've gotten a lot, what qualifies as a new project? We've tried to kind of define that a little bit more, but for MLS purposes, a new project would be defined as a project that does not have any previously state, federal, or local funding assigned to it. Improvements can be previously designed, but then only the construction portion would be eligible for MLS funding. Another question that I believe came in after the last webinar, what is your definition of shovel-ready? For MLS purposes, shovel-ready indicates if it would be possible for a project to begin construction shortly after receiving the authorization to incur costs. Another question, can a roads project combine multiple roads into one project? The answer is yes. You can combine multiple road segments into a more complex MLS road improvement design. Please remember, though, on your project application to demonstrate the overall economic benefits as well as the improved connectivity resulting from the road improvement design, and please include all of the segments on the map that you attach to the application. Another question, does the secondary sponsor assume any cost share responsibility? MLS agreements are going to be with the primary sponsor only. Any agreement where the secondary sponsor assumes project cost share responsibility would be between the primary and the secondary sponsor, not with WSDOT. Project reimbursement will be for costs incurred by the primary sponsor after MLS award, and all project documentation must be submitted by the primary sponsor. Another question that we addressed actually during the last webinar, will Davis-Bacon prevailing wage rates apply to MLS projects? The answer to that is no. Davis-Bacon federal prevailing wage rates would not apply to state-funded MLS projects. Another question, if a municipality gets funding for MLS and another program, say for example STP or TAP, can they substitute their other program's award amount towards a different project in that program? The answer to that is no. The project sponsor can accept a funding award from only one program. Another question, will each committee be reviewing all projects or just projects related to their type of community or some other combination? For example, will the Towns Committee be reviewing all applications or only applications received from towns? The answer, the Town Committee would only be reviewing the town applications. The same would be true of the city and village committees and the county committees for their respective applications. In the case of multi-jurisdictional applications, the application would be forwarded to the primary sponsor committee for program award and for funding. Another question, does submitting an application through the MLS program preclude your community from serving on the review committees? The answer is no. Submitting an application would not preclude the municipality from serving on the review committee. However, committee members would be prevented from scoring any application in which they have an interest. Another question, how long after you have provided documentation will it take to receive reimbursement? It appears we have to provide proof of payment to the contractor prior to reimbursement. Therefore, we need the funds to cover the payment until we receive the reimbursement. The answer to that, WSDOT processes requests for reimbursement generally within 30 days of receipt. Each request for reimbursement must provide supporting documentation for the reimbursement activities submitted along with that request. Another question, can a project have more than one primary sponsor? The answer is no. A single primary sponsor is necessary so that WSDOT can issue a state municipal agreement. However, eligible counties and municipalities may have sub-agreements to complete a single MLS project. The state would not be party to those sub-agreements. A secondary sponsor may be a local unit of government, a tribal government, or a private organization with funding or with project delivery obligations. Another question that came in the last couple of days, the scoring matrix on page 2 of the MLS program guidelines, will there be any materials available prior to applications being due that will provide more information on how the committees will be scoring projects? This information will help local units of government review projects and submit their best projects. WSDOT does not plan to publish additional materials on scoring. The scoring rubric published in the MLS guidelines really is intended to give an overview for how points are going to be allocated for projects. The guidelines speak to the evaluation criteria broadly and generally, and applicants are expected to speak to these criteria really when they submit their application. Another question, do ineligible costs count toward the minimum project cost? The answer is yes. The application should list total project cost and then separate out eligible and ineligible costs. Again, that's in section G of the application form itself. The up to 90% cost share is based on the eligible costs, but the total improvement should be outlined in the application for the committee's evaluation. Another question, can photos be included in multiple pages after the narrative? Yes, photos and spreadsheets can be included, and they're in addition to the one-page narrative limit. They don't count against that narrative limit. Another question, can a municipality submit more than one project for consideration? If yes, should we prioritize our projects? And if we should prioritize, how should we reflect that prioritization for review? A municipality may submit multiple applications. Within the narrative, just indicate the project priority for committee consideration. Please submit all applications in a single email, in one single email that's sent in by the application deadline. Within the body of that email, please also note the project priority status. Another question, can 2 counties cooperate on a project? The answer is yes, 2 counties can decide to cooperate on a project. However, 1 county would need to serve as the primary sponsor for the application. Question, do you score more points from evaluators if you agree to contribute more than the 10% match? No, no additional points are allocated if the primary sponsor agrees to contribute more than the 10% match. However, it may be a consideration by the committee in deciding on final awards. Another question, are bridge deck replacements subject to replace in kind? The answer is no, they are not subject to replace in kind. Question, can a local private super farm be a secondary sponsor if equipment loading is the primary issue? And the answer to that, a local private super farm could be a secondary sponsor. The primary sponsor and holder of the state municipal agreement would be the municipality for the public transportation improvement. However, keep in mind, maintenance and equipment purchases would be ineligible road improvements. Another question, should attachments to the application, i.e. photos, the narrative section, the spreadsheet, be included in the same PDF as the application itself? A single PDF definitely would be preferred. However, if that is not possible, please submit the applications along with any attached documents within the same email. Again, are multi-jurisdictional applications eligible? The answer is yes, multi-jurisdictional projects are eligible as long as the project itself is eligible. In the narrative section, the applicants would specify that the application is intended to be multi-jurisdictional. The application would then be forwarded to the primary sponsor committee for evaluation. Another really good question, what is a connecting highway? Connecting highways are local streets and roads that carry state highway travel through cities and villages. The quarterly disbursement of connecting highway aids help local governments maintain these streets and roads at state trunk highway system standards. Additional information about connecting highways as well as connecting highway aids are available on the WSDOT website. Another question we've received, would a stormwater pond needed as part of a road project be eligible? The answer is yes, as long as it is a component of an eligible MLS application for an improvement project. It may not be funded by MLS if the need is due to another road project that is already receiving funding. Another question, is it acceptable for a municipality to be a secondary sponsor on more than one application? The answer is yes. Municipalities can be the secondary sponsor for more than one MLS application. Regarding bicycle and pedestrian trails, if a bicycle pedestrian trail is already in place but is not yet paved, would it be eligible for funding? There is no previous state and federal funding on the trail. Provided that the municipality listed as the primary sponsor owns the trail, paving a trail would be an eligible bicycle pedestrian improvement. The pavement cannot be the final work component for the bicycle pedestrian trail funded as part of another project. And I think we might have a couple more. Is a trail rehabilitation project that allows bicycles, pedestrians, and snowmobiles ineligible because it includes motorized and non-motorized users? The answer to that is yes. For MLS purposes, a trail that includes bicycles, pedestrians, as well as snowmobiles in the winter months would be considered mixed use and would be ineligible for funding. And another question, could we dovetail the MLS proposal with a TAP grant proposal? And the answer is no, you can only accept funding from one source for an MLS project. And again, I do want to reiterate, any questions that we didn't get to today, we do apologize, but we will get those questions included on the full Q&A session that we'll be posting at the end of next week. So on behalf of myself, along with Ryan, we want to thank you for your participation in today's informational webinar. And we look forward to your applications, and we hope you have a good rest of your day.